When we talk about public space, we often end up trying to articulate its value, or perhaps we argue about what it's for. Is it for cappuccinos? Childcare? Entertainment or sport? Protest? Anonymity? One thing that we can be sure of is that it matters. London could be a public city that others would envy. Its spaces are layered and full of history. Its public realm is where the city lives, and the people have had to battle to maintain that. Against enclosure, they tore down the fences, opened up the commons, and petitioned the Queen for a people's park. Today, public space is again a problem. The public spaces of London, the collective assets of the city's citizens, are being sold to corporations, privatised without explanation or apology. This charter is a territorial-scale strategy that enables the rapid construction of now much-needed public space to ease the damages caused by the insidious creep of privatised public spaces. Born out of shifting attitudes to land ownership, access and use, this is a rewriting of the Public London Charter. It is a project for London as a public city. In the year 1217, two documents became the foundations of the British Constitution: Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, the latter asserting that everybody had a right to subsistence, a right to a home, and a right to work in the commons. Yet throughout history these commons have been plundered by enclosure, privatisation and neglect. 800 years later, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, locked in a new and fast-establishing approach to land ownership. By promising to publish a Public London Charter, Khan accepted a point of no return. That from this moment forth, the ownership and management of London's new public spaces would unavoidably lie with the private sector. Khan promised a charter simply to set out the rights and responsibilities of users, owners, and managers of public spaces. But this amounts to a submission. It isn't enough. It should aim to create a strategy to deal with the consequences of an existing and historically embedded condition for London's land. This condition is enclosure. Enclosure today is the 2 million hectares of public land that have been privatised since 1979 through a process known as disposal. In London, this condition has become endemic. This comprises a large territory across the city and forms the expanding network of sites upon which the Charter will act. To identify potential sites, variables were derived by mapping predictions and aspirations for the city outlined in the current London plan. Population, density, the green belt, and current availability of open space. Considering these things, a 30-year window is identified in which to establish 9,000 hectares of new publicly accessible open space. To do this, the Charter establishes two new planning conditions. Firstly, the establishment of community land trusts to manage public realm, and secondly, the construction of large architecture in which to provide genuinely public space. The public space that this charter suggests is a shared, rich territory. Some of it is empty, some of it is highly programmed, and some of it is inside buildings. Most importantly, it has the potential to transform from day to day, as it is negotiated by work lunchers, cyclists, protesters, dog walkers. The formal strategy for the Charter relies on a physical structural dependency on proposed developments. Based on the principle that the free land upon which to construct new public space in London simply does not exist, the Charter acknowledges that this ground must be built. The gesture proposed is simple. A large volume straddles a portion of the existing site, enclosing the ground between buildings to move the open space upwards. The architecture deploys a kind of structural opportunism, exploiting the over-designed capabilities of concrete core and slab structures built today. The frame creates substantial depth, providing three distinct public spaces: an enclosed ground floor that remains privately owned, a public interior, and public open space. The architecture dramatically increases the provision of genuinely public space. Public architecture is inherently vulnerable to the relentlessness of privatisation, yet it is a risk intrinsic to the act of building. It is our duty not to remain complicit in the status quo of space. It is our duty to suggest these new spaces regardless of this risk. In a deliberate surrender, the ground floor is enclosed, a tactical manoeuvre to reverse the offensive claim of the public realm between buildings. Enclosure is a structural opportunity, and it depends on both bureaucratic and spatial forces. It is simple to have conversations about buildings, and yet when we talk about the public realm, it's much more difficult, more furious. It usually comes down to land ownership and to access, because when you think about public space, there are a few things that come to mind. One of the most obvious ones is festival, providing rhythm to the year and animation to collective life. But then there are other kinds of things, questions of power in public space, sometimes monumental displays of power. And of course, the public spaces are the places that people come to when they're very upset. Designs of public spaces must consider all these things, and the extent to which they do is determined partly by who makes the spaces, but also by what we expect them to do. This is Granary Square, and we are often shown places like this as examples of really great public space. Who would complain? It's got fountains, it's clean, but beneath all that it's serving a function, adding a bit of lustre to the millions of square feet of office space and luxury apartments that are built all around it. Spaces like that are not half as public as they are alleging. There's increasing momentum behind the argument against privately owned public space, about the fact that people can be relegated from certain spaces.
You cannot carry on filming, sir. You must leave.
Okay, can I clarify one point?
Sir.
Where are we not allowed to film?
As I explained to you earlier, sir, anywhere on this Irish limestone.
In London, particularly over the last few decades, there is a sense of freedom that seems to be vanishing. It is a certain kind of freedom that is difficult to ascertain, but is one that we must restore. The alternative is that a hyper-commercial view of the world becomes reality, and every square metre has a pound sign attached to it. Anything empty or unused is waste. Of course, more conceptual notions of an ideal public space are much more content with emptiness, but policymakers and developers really fear this. In the Alternative Charter, the ground floor of the private development is finally liberated from the burden of pretending to be genuinely public, publicly accessible, with no illusion of actually being public. Physically enclosing privately owned public spaces does not change how they are designed to perform, yet they become more spatially honest. By enclosing the POPs, its qualities are exaggerated. In its new semi-interiority, the ground floor becomes an acute manifestation of the attitudes of its owners. A hyper-private, hyper-POPs. POPs are usually the product of a deal between cities and private developers. Cities grant zoning concessions, and developers provide public realm in return. This charter intervenes with the conditional nature of these deals. It should empower communities to deliver public space, and there are already policy frameworks in place that can be used to do this. In 2011, the Localism Act introduced the community right to build and the community right to bid. This defined in law a way to pass public land earmarked for disposal back into the hands of the people. Communities are quite well placed to be involved in delivering public realm, because they know the kinds of spaces and amenities that their neighbourhoods need. Most often associated with housing, community land trusts are corporate bodies established to further the interests of a community by acquiring and managing land. This charter embeds CLTs within a new and mutually beneficial model for the provision, ownership, and management of public spaces. Entirely replacing the requirement for POPs, developers must work directly with the communities in which they wish to build. Primarily accessed via large ramps, the deep structure creates a large public interior used for the re-establishment of services and commons amenities. Facilities like public toilets and public libraries that once formed an important part of the social and cultural commons could be provided for. But more than that, the public interior provides a place to shelter from the rain, acts as a place for encounter, or one for solitude. The new public open space is the simplest, articulated by the changing height of its surface and by the few volumes that perforate it to allow light to reach the deep interiors beneath. Intended to be as low maintenance as possible, the materials and surface treatments vary. Recycled EPDM for softness, or the reclaimed Yorkstone and granite that have paved London's streets for centuries.
There was never intentionally designed for skateboarding.
Its surface is kept plain, a rejection of the anxiety surrounding emptiness in public space. It's okay that it's blank, empty, and unproductive, because it's a new layer atop a city where everything else isn't. Its quality is as much in the reality that in this space, unlike in a pops, you can exercise your citizenship to its fullest. This is not a charter based on policy, but one driven by architecture. It is designed to produce a mutually enriching and yet highly contrasting spatial arrangement. Khan's charter proposes 3 signatories: the Mayor of London, the Chief Planner, and the landowner. But this alternative charter demands a 4th: the citizen. The geographer David Harvey once wrote that the freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is one of the most precious yet most neglected of our human rights. The citizen, awakened to the reality that privatization has left the public without land of their own, is empowered to take some of it back. 800 years after Magna Carta emphasized the citizen's right to claim common resources, a new charter must be written.